Hey everybody, I'd like to introduce the topic of the Jeffersonian West, talk a little bit about how important President Jefferson, who served from 1801 to 1809, was to the American West, and discuss the moving population to the West, especially after the American Revolution. Also talk about the Burr conspiracy, Aaron Burr, former vice president, who moved to the West and engaged in what can only be called a very confusing set of events, and then discuss the implications of the Louisiana Purchase and also the acquisition of West Florida, which isn't talked a lot about in history classes, but it has to do with us being in Louisiana. And it's a reminder to us that diplomacy between the United States and Spain and other countries moved at a slow speed, but was also at the same time very important to bringing new territory into the nation's borders. When Jefferson's elected in 1801, he calls his time as president a revolution, a new party, his Jeffersonian Republican Party. The parties and the election took place and changed peacefully, which was a significant development, he thought. The population of the country was growing rapidly. In 1800, there were 5.3 million people living in the United States. 20% are slaves, 1/5 of the population. Fertility rates among white and blacks in the nation are very high, some of the highest in the world. Usually, women give birth to, on average, 7 children, which is double that of the European states at the time. And going back to the colonial period, the population had doubled every 20 years. So this is a nation moving to the west, expanding into areas that we're going to talk about, and it is fairly healthy, free from epidemic disease, child mortality fairly low compared to other parts of the world. It's also a remarkably young country. In 1810, when the census was taken just after Jefferson's term in office ended, 70% of the white population was under the age of 25. During this time, Tennessee's population increased tenfold in a period from 1790 to 1820. New York added 15 new western counties. So we might think that the West is movement to and across the mountains, but the frontier, the western line, would include areas of sparsely settled states that became developed fairly quickly, especially after the American Revolution. With this expansion was, of course, popular among people moving west. It put pressures on Native Americans. It increased the hold of the institution of slavery, especially in the American South. But Jefferson's opposition party, called the Federalists, the party of Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams, could see the writing on the wall. A Western population where 1/10 of the people, only 1/10, lived in the East, the old established colonial population centers, probably wasn't good for the Federalist Party. So this Western expansion, fueled by a president, the Republican Thomas Jefferson, was not good for the future of their political party, the Federalists. They often, the Federalists, classify those moving to the West as crude and unenlightened people, quote, always adverse to the best measures, unquote. Federalists have a different philosophy about government and expansion. They don't exactly welcome it. Among other things, it might weaken their political control into the 1800s. Everyone who lives in Kentucky in 1800 was born and raised outside the new state's borders. So people are descending on these new territories at a rapid pace, and they came from somewhere else. So that shows you the very dramatic movement that's happening in the nation. The United States in 1800, see on the map, we have the established states, and then beyond the mountains, areas of the Northwest Territory above the Ohio River, and of course below this would represent the Southwest Territory, with quite a bit of uncertainty, especially with the borders of the Southwest Territory between the United States and the nation of Spain. During the time that Jefferson was in office, there were frontier forts and villages that became cities that we are very familiar with today. They had been born prior to 1800, but their size increases dramatically. St. Louis, an old French and Spanish fort city on the Mississippi. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Lexington. Here's Cincinnati in its infancy in the Ohio Territory and later the state of Ohio. Lexington, Kentucky, Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Nashville, Louisville, growing here in the Northwest Territory during the 1790s and early 1800s. Following a pattern established in the colonial time, most of these towns are, of course, on bodies of water, on rivers. By the end of Jefferson's presidency in 1809, 1 million people live west of the mountain, and they're moving many times. That's the other distinctive feature of migrations to the west. Sometimes someone moving from, let's say, Virginia to Tennessee may move again into Kentucky or into Indiana in the course of their life. So this is a nation on the move. It is growing rapidly, and it is young during Jefferson's time in office. The country also remained overwhelmingly rural and agricultural, which a lot of people believed still kept the United States, this infant country, in kind of a almost backward social development. The expanding population was supposed to move the country from one stage, kind of this colonial development, into a more industrialized, but it wasn't happening. Certainly the old established cities were becoming larger, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. The infancy of the Industrial Revolution was having an impact. But in the West, with people moving very quickly, 19 of 20 folks are living in areas of less than 2,500 people, essentially 90% of the population. 90% of the population also engage in farming of some kind, working the land. So meaning it's not urban or city, but it is a rural country in 1801. There's only 6 areas in the United States that have more than 10,000 people. In England, just to give you a comparison, 1/3 of the people in that country live in cities, 33%, with only about 10% of Americans living in cities. Well, Jefferson, elected in 1800, beginning his term in office in 1801, immediately faces the west, towards the Trans-Appalachian Mountains and beyond. Ironic, because he never in his life traveled farther than western Virginia, where his home, Monticello, was in Albemarle County, what's now Charlottesville in Virginia. The United States moving quickly is what Jefferson hoped for. Even though the Federalist Party, his opposition, was hesitant for various reasons, it might weaken the country. It would certainly diminish the Federalists' hold on politics if more people were moving to the West and their own choices politically were with Jefferson and his successors. He also argued, that President Jefferson, that the area could be a safety valve. Republican society, meaning not necessarily the Republican Party, but the Republic, where people chose their elected officials to make decisions for them. This would allow the movement west for Jefferson, would lessen the impact of cities and the miseries involved in cities. Jefferson had a deep, deep dislike and distrust of cities. Their concentrations of capital or money, their tendency to have epidemics of disease. The capital was in Philadelphia. There were frequent yellow fever outbreaks in the 1790s. One almost killed President Washington. if there was no concentrated working class, if there was no devotion exclusively to industrialization or corruption. That's what Jefferson saw when he went to European cities. He didn't want the United States to follow that same path. What he says in his famous quote about the West speaks a lot about the man himself. Here's Jefferson, quote, "By enlarging the empire of liberty, we multiply its auxiliaries and provide new sources of renovation. Should its principles at any time degenerate in those portions of our country which gave them birth," unquote. So in other words, Jefferson's saying we will eliminate the possibility of the United States developing like Europe. And for him, that's very much a good thing. Jefferson may be the most expansion-minded president in our nation's history, but what does this idea, the famous quote or phrase from that quote, empire of liberty? It's not an empire in the British sense, where you dominate people on a continent or have an overseas empire. It's an American version of the empire of liberty. Some of it, of course, is, by our own definition, kind of a colonial treatment of other people, as we'll see, especially with the expansion of slavery and Jefferson's opinions and attempts to deal with Native Americans. Jefferson's immediate concern when he takes office in 1801, when he looks at the map, of course, would be the presence of different European countries in what is now North America, what will expand later to be the continental United States. There were three forces on the continent. Spain, of course, the neighbor to the American West, and at the time they were in possession of almost all of the Western territories. Great Britain, of course, still was claiming areas of the United States bordering the Great Lakes and near the northern provinces of Massachusetts, which we now call Maine. There was also a section in what we call today the Pacific Northwest, where several European countries had claims to that area. So Jefferson thought to make this empire of liberty a reality, the nation would have to expand. He sees a continent. He sees the United States moving across the continent, even into Canada and possibly even Mexico. Foreigners were in awe, when you think about it, of the speed at which and the rapid settlement of this new upstart nation. And many people predicted that at the end of the day, this would lead to its undoing. You couldn't have a republic, this type of government, over a wide-ranging continent, a continent that a lot of people, even Jefferson's party, thought if it expands too rapidly, it would weaken. And it would actually, with other foreign influences around, many people who call themselves Westerners, settlers moving into Kentucky, Tennessee, what's now Ohio, Indiana, would they have allegiance or would they uphold and follow the government that's now in and had been moved to Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River? These were unknown. Jefferson had faith that it could survive and it would thrive. Others were not so sure, especially folks in the East who thought of Westerners as kind of the term they would use, white savages, compared them to Native Americans. During Jefferson's presidency, a triangle wedge of settlement we would have from New York to Ohio, Georgia to Tennessee. You can kind of see that what that looks like, people funneling into those areas during the 1790s and 1800s. The sides of the triangle meet at the frontier outpost of what is near present-day St. Louis. It's the gateway to the plains, the gateway arch, symbolic of people moving beyond that area in the early 1800s. Of course, Lewis and Clark are responsible for making folks aware back east what existed in the West and destroying a lot of the misinformation about the American continental West. Within the triangle that I just talked about, there are huge areas that lack settlement. They are vacant. They are inhabited by Native Americans, which will present a challenge to the United States. Washington and Knox, as I stated before, had an idea about how to create homelands or types of reservations for Native Americans, but that met with, of course, resistance in the South thanks to Georgia, and in the Northwest Territory, conquest, military victory was needed to push Indians beyond the Ohio Territory and closer towards the Mississippi River. American leaders expected that migration, if it was too fast, would lead to chaos. That's why the nation tried, even in the 1780s, to organize the Northwest Territory with the Land Act, then the Northwest Ordinance. You needed surveying, you needed to make land purchases, and of course you needed government authority of some sort in its infancy as the population increased. And if it didn't and was not settled in an orderly fashion, many people thought bad things could happen. And that idea is illustrated by a quote from one Federalist who's talking about the movement to the West. He says, quote, "We rush like a comet into infinite space. In our wild career, we may jostle some other world out of its orbit, but we shall, in every event, quench the light of our own," unquote. You see a bit of uncertainty in that quote from that particular Federalist politician. Not sure if this is actually good for the nation or not. Now, in the Northwest Territory, a region that we're going to deal with to start, then introduce Louisiana, talk a little bit about the Southwest Territory. The year of 1794, even before Jefferson comes into office, is very important. That's because, thanks to treaties made with Indians in the Ohio Territory, specifically the Treaty of Greenville, opened this region, Ohio, to very rapid settlement. People pour into the Ohio Valley from New York, Pennsylvania, and New England during the decade after 1794. Ohio becomes a state in 1803. That says something right there. So there was a plan to survey the land. There was a plan to get some type of government. And of course, after 1801, based on Jefferson's and laws in Congress, the price of land was reduced the minimum purchase that people had to make. That's one of the determining factors in whether or not people would move west, if they could purchase the land. And now the price went down, and the amount that you had to buy, which was quite substantial, was cut. And so that opens up the potential of more people to make those purchases. Credit terms were relaxed. You can buy land on credit. And then these territories, Ohio and others that will become several states in this region, 5 states in the Northwest Territories, then very quickly, frantically, we might say, try to write the laws and set up governments in those areas. So from this region and from a reflection of the need to create some form of basic government, different territorial governments are organized. Indiana in 1800, of course, just to the west of Ohio. The Michigan Territory in 1805. The Illinois Territory in 1809. And then, as I mentioned, Ohio as a state in 1803. And the South, the Mississippi Territory, was created by Congress in 1798. That's a reflection of a treaty with the nation of Spain, where we finally were able to figure out the border with Spanish Florida, with the West, as far as the Spanish colony of Louisiana, before it becomes French, of course. Planters from the old colonial South then began to stream into the area from Vicksburg on the Mississippi River to Spanish New Orleans. Though the region was dominated by those who support Jefferson and the Republican Party. That's exactly what he wanted. Jefferson's trying to build, of course, his political party, not for just himself, but for those who follow him. A legacy, a dynasty of the West being very loyal to his own Jeffersonian Republican Party. Differences emerge in the American West, especially in the North and South, specifically over slavery. The contrast wasn't apparent right away, but most early settlers rely on the labor of their family early on. Hey, if we're having 7 children by average families, you've got a small labor force right there at your disposal. So as those folks move to the West, they build lean-to houses, they clear land and begin to grow crops in small numbers. Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana. In the Northwest Territory, their crops are mainly corn and wheat. Of that crop yields, some people turn them into whiskey. In the Southwest, we have the development of corn for food, tobacco, and cotton. And these are 2 cash crops that are going to develop very quickly, reaching into the Southwest Territories. And that might determine who settles from the South to the Southwest, the old colonial South, bringing slaves with them, will determine the fate of that area. The difference between the North and South is essentially over slavery. Would it move into the Northwest Territory in the early 1800s? Well, small farmers and families were the first to move into the area. They would be able to keep in place what Congress had written in 1787, that in the Northwest Territory, slavery would be banned. But some people thought just because Congress wrote that law, would it exactly be followed? Would a territory, once it becomes a state, change the law? Could it change the law? These were uncertainties in the early years. Early pioneers were soon overwhelmed by substantial planters who came into the Southwest Territories, what's Kentucky and Tennessee, with slaves. Slaves made up as much as 20% of the population in Middle Tennessee when statehood happened in the 1790s. Very rapidly, we have Kentucky and then Tennessee, 1792 and 1796. A second wave are men of means who can buy or parcel land in the most desirable areas. The Cumberland Valley in central Tennessee has plantations established as early as 1800. Cotton areas, raising tobacco as well. The early leaders of the regions, the Northwest Territory and the Southwest Territory, include people prominent in American history, in the future 2 U.S. presidents. William Henry Harrison, here in his military uniform. Harrison had been at the Battle of Fallen Timbers with General Anthony Wayne. That's the battle that determined the defeat of the Indians in the Ohio Territory in 1794. He marries the daughter of an important surveyor and becomes Register of the Land Office in Ohio, and then later Secretary of the Northwest Territory appointed by President Adams. So this is an ambitious young man who sees the West as his future. When Ohio was separated from part of the Northwest Territory, in other words, they're going to survey the land and create an independent of all the Northwest Territories. They carve Ohio from that region. Harrison then became the territorial governor of the Indiana Territory to the west of Ohio, and that was a political position that was very important. Harrison and his allies, by his family connections, by his political connections, actually attempt to repeal the ban on slavery in the Northwest Territory. But the legislature passes laws that sustain de facto slavery by simply calling them indentures. So even in an area that is technically puts a ban on slavery, this region, based on who's moving into the area, they find ways to get around the law. Others move into the area from the north, into the Northwest Territories, and they object to legalized slavery. They make arguments such as the institution of slavery makes men haughty and proud. It creates an aristocracy of the very wealthy who control politics. And it also keeps non-slaveholders out of the area. This is an argument that will continue to be made up to the American Civil War. If slavery moves into a territory, the ability to hire free labor or to work or to compete against slave owners is compromised. So it's not simply a question of we don't want slavery to move in because we don't like slavery. It's more about an unfair advantage slave owners have as opposed to small farmers and larger planters, some of whom do hire labor. You don't obviously have to pay slaves. So the economic argument is what we're talking about here in the Northwest Territory. When the area is divided again into Indiana and Illinois, so we have this entire region, first section carved out Ohio, then Indiana, then Illinois. As people move, this whole region would be called Indiana, but later on, they'd have to separate. This whole region could not, of course, become one separate state. So they begin to, again, make the boundaries for what we know as the present-day states. So what will later take place and actually disappoint William Henry Harrison is that the area is divided again into Indiana and Illinois. Anti-slavery men are elected to Congress. And the fight between Harrison and those who want to keep slavery out continues after 1803. Anti-slavery men have the history of Ohio on their side. Ohio had been settled so fast because it banned slaves, people argue. That's why it goes from the Treaty of Greenville, 1794, that signs away a good portion of the territory. Less than 10 years after that battle, which the Indian presence was actually stunting the growth. But now that it had been signed over to the United States, in 9 years, we see Ohio statehood. If you can stop these free arguers for free labor, they're saying if you can stop aristocratic Southerners from moving in and encourage the settlement of folks from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, to move beyond Ohio into the Indiana and Illinois territory, that would prevent slavery from moving in. And there's a testament to that by the names in these towns in the Northwest Territory. Cambridge, Lexington, Springfield, Hartford, scattered through the Northwest. So communities in the old colonial New England were moving to this area, and they carried their place names with them, renaming regions here for places that they had come from or their parents had known earlier. The Southwest, the region here below the Ohio River, we've got Kentucky statehood 1792, Tennessee in 1796, and a region that will be later known as simply the Mississippi Territory, created by the Congress in 1798. It's less diversified as far as small planters, free labor, and slave labor. There are more and more plantations operating cotton crops as it becomes clear that that plant will thrive in that region. Overseas markets are increasing, and few towns grow in the area. There's a real market for American cotton in the late 1700s, but especially after 1800, and the cotton gin, of course, turns everything around. Like folks in the Northwest, people in the Southwest are on the move. They push down the river towards Spanish New Orleans. Again, the one real city in the American South outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Spain had opened access to the river, the Mississippi, and the use of New Orleans in 1795. The treaty that the U.S. signed with the nation of Spain also opened up American use. So those who were considering moving in this region, I mean, you use rivers as highways. You get your product to New Orleans, it then enters the Gulf and goes to the Atlantic. If you don't have access to that, it's a measure that the Spanish knew would prevent Americans from rushing into this area. And the Spanish were, of course, worried about these land-hungry Americans moving into their part of the world. They closed the river to make sure that it could postpone an American takeover. But now that that river was open, they were becoming more concerned about that. And that's certainly what Jefferson hoped would be the case. Americans would just move down there and by a numbers game, would be able to, by treaty, hopefully, sign over access to the lower Mississippi River Valley, maybe even acquire New Orleans. Jefferson thinks it's basically inevitable by the time he's in office. His belief is that settlers will push towards New Orleans, push to Florida, and even eventually he thinks Cuba will fall to the United States in the Caribbean. He compared it often when he wrote and spoke about this as ripe fruit falling piece by piece from a tree, and it would fall to the Americans. In his mind, it just required the country be patient, and it would take place. Well, the game changer, as far as Jefferson was concerned, with the speed of which the U.S. may want to acquire areas of Florida and New Orleans, making that process sooner rather than later was a decision that was made in Europe. Spain retrocedes, meaning it signs a treaty and returns the Louisiana Territory back to France in a secret treaty, which is not all that secret. Americans began asking about it, and the French and Spanish kind of shrugged and went into a series of denials about whether this treaty actually took place. It's kind of one of the worst kept secrets in Europe. There is a belief among the Spanish that France can serve as a better force or nation to maintain a barrier between Americans and possibly Mexican silver. I mean, if you surrender this region to the United States, the Spanish believe it's only a matter of time before they keep going, try to claim areas of Mexico. It also had a lot of advantages as far as the French and Spanish were concerned. Many of the people there were not Spanish, they were French. There was a significant population, but this region, once upon a time, had been claimed in the colonial period by the nation of France. At the same time, the acquisition of Louisiana in 1800 from Spain to France was part of a plan to possibly even reestablish a French empire in North America. But the first goal for now the leader of France, Napoleon, was to put down a rebellion in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is the western half of Hispaniola, the island in the Caribbean, which is now the nation of Haiti. There was, and had been ever since the French Revolution, unrest and now a full-fledged slave and free people of color rebellion on this island. It was led by this man, Toussaint Louverture, who would first welcome French army into Saint-Domingue. And then, when it appeared that the French army was going to simply end and restore the slave regime, Toussaint and his slave rebels turned against the French. Jefferson hears about the treaty concerning Louisiana, and not surprisingly, he is concerned. In Jefferson's mind, if Spain controls Louisiana, it's not the end of the world. It's a temporary situation. We would eventually acquire Louisiana from Spain. Spain's best days are behind them as far as an overseas empire. Their colonies are not long for this world, in other words. France is a whole other matter. Jefferson has a quote when he effectively says if France can expand or control Louisiana, at that point on, he says, we're going to have to marry ourselves to the English Navy, meaning American ships will have to get the protection of the British Navy to travel to other ports around the world. And he just cannot abide by that decision. So Jefferson offers to buy the island of New Orleans, access to the Mississippi River, and the Floridas, both parts of Florida, the peninsula here and the Panhandle, all the way up to what would be, of course, Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the Mississippi River, for $6 million. He sends fellow Virginian James Monroe to press the French with this deal. The French first scoff at the offer. They say, we'll see about that. We'll get back to you. They want to hear about any progress of the army sent to the Caribbean islands. To put down the slave rebellion, the French would send upwards of 40,000 soldiers in an unsuccessful attempt. Toussaint's rebels, tropical diseases such as yellow fever, decimate, destroy Napoleon's army in Saint-Domingue. Napoleon's goal is to, after putting down this rebellion, then move to New Orleans. But that's not going to happen. In fact, most people in the country are panicky. They tell Jefferson, well, we need to expand the size of the military. We need to devote more of the budget to increasing the army and the navy. And Jefferson says, no, the rebel slave army is going to destroy the French force in Saint-Domingue. And that is exactly what happens. He may be one of the only people who predicts that accurately. When the army in Saint-Domingue is destroyed, Napoleon says it's not worth it. The French Empire in North America, beyond at least the Caribbean, isn't going to happen. And so the nation of France offers all of it, all of the Louisiana territory, for $15 million, 900,000 acres of the West with, shall we say, slightly ambiguous borders, meaning people aren't quite sure. They have the water, they have the Mississippi, they think, okay, that may have and may represent the eastern border, but what about everything else? They weren't exactly sure. And he makes the deal, and Federalists react in horror with what happens with the Louisiana Purchase Treaty of 1803. They are aghast at the purchase. One Federalist named Fisher Ames of Massachusetts says of the area, it is, quote, a great waste, a wilderness unpeopled by any beings except wolves and wandering Indians. We are to spend money of which we have too little for land of which we already have too much. Interesting quote, represents in some ways the Federalists' hesitation to bringing in more land. Among other things, they think it may or may not be legal for Jefferson to do that as president, but you can read between the lines. The Federalists realize it's the beginning of their end of their existence as a political party. Finally, there was the detail of the treaty. Could the people of Louisiana, who are very different, a significant, of course, population of slaves, a significant population of free people of color, some American, French, Spanish, how do these folks fit in? How are they made part of the United States? Article 3 in the Louisiana Purchase Treaty states that the U.S. would incorporate inhabitants of the territory eventually to the Union. Most thought this would not be easy, either legally throughout the Constitution or culturally. There's a big difference. People had different races, religion, and more importantly, a different kind of government. Americans were used to legislatures, to elected governors. The French and Spanish system was very, very different. Jefferson and others said, well, until the people are ready for democracy, the Americans will move in and govern. And it says something of the fact that even though there is a significant population in lower Louisiana around New Orleans, or more akin to what we think of as the state of Louisiana, it didn't go from the purchase to statehood for nearly 10 years. So that takes a while, and it wasn't about the population reaching a threshold. That had to happen in places like Ohio and other territories in the Northwest. It was about this incorporation idea and the fact that could people who were not mostly American deal with American form of government. The president was given more power in Louisiana than in other eastern areas. So there were accusations that Jefferson was governing Louisiana with his appointee very arbitrarily. So to try to bring some order to the area, by the suggestion of the president, Congress in 1804 divides the purchase by a line that is the northern border of the current state of Louisiana. So this would be known as the Orleans Territory, most of which we consider now the state of Louisiana. There was some uncertainty about whether or not the sections of the Floridas had actually been purchased, or Florida at all. Jefferson would later say, yes, it was. The Spanish were saying, we don't think so. To the north, you simply had the Louisiana Territory, this region above the state, what we think of mostly as the West, from Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It's a vast and little-known area called the District of Louisiana, with one military governor, James Wilkinson, put in charge. The southern area, the territory of New Orleans, would have New Orleans, the city, as its capital. The borders with the Spanish territory were unclear, and for the next easily dozen years, the United States and Spain tried to work out those borders. It became a region of adventurers, runaway slaves, troublemakers, conspiracies, both in the West, where we're dealing with the Orleans Territory, along that border with what's now Spanish Texas, and even to the north. Jefferson shifted from Virginia, a man named William Claiborne, to Louisiana from the Mississippi Territory as the first governor. He's only 29 years old, and he feels, you can read his letters and diaries, quite the stranger in a strange land, not used to the customs of the European countries, not trusted by the French and Spanish residents, and very much from a Virginia background where slaves are slaves, and a significant population of free people of color who have some rights and privileges. Not a world he's familiar with, but he's not familiar with the Spanish and French system of slavery. Claiborne is given near dictatorial rule over the Spanish, French, and Africans in the region after 1804. He's a white Anglo-Protestant, but he doesn't share a lot of the values of a mostly Catholic and European population. Especially trying, he comes from a area where there's no gray sections about defining white-black relations. The slave, free people of color dichotomy that exists that exists in New Orleans didn't exist in Virginia, where he was from. So this presents a host of challenges, a historic division in the Orleans Territory, black, free-colored, white. What rights could be given to free people of color? French and Spanish did grant several. This is something that most Americans from the East and the old colonial South would be unfamiliar with. Could they own land? Could they own guns? Become citizens? Fight in the militia ranks for the city? Well, folks weren't really sure. In 1804, officially the United States, in a ceremony in the French Quarter, go through the ceremony of changing flags from Spain to France to the United States. Immediately after changing these flags, where the stars and stripes fly over the city, Congress bans the importation of slaves from abroad. Now that means from overseas, not necessarily from other territories. There was a hope that the internal domestic slave trade, meaning slaves moving from the Upper South to, in this case, the Orleans Territory, would supply the needs of Americans. Franco-Spanish, French and Spanish slavery was very different from the American version. It left open the opportunity of owners to manumit or free their slaves, for slaves to purchase their own freedom, something that the Americans were not at all used to. In 2 years after the Louisiana Purchase, 200 slaves buy their own freedom. Free people of color make up 20% of the population in the Orleans Territory. This was something that a Virginian Claiborne and Jefferson were not at all used to. Consequently, the number of free blacks, the ability of whites and blacks to marry, interracial marriage, mixed race children, much higher. And the U.S. was not familiar with the legal ways to define its citizens and to give rights or take away rights from an established pattern that the French and Spanish had for generations. The hope was that the area could be brought in as American as quickly as possible. But Americans, for the most part in the East, think that Louisiana is something of a strange and dangerous place. The West as a region is something we've talked about, you've read about. It's a region that there is a lot of unknown, and nothing says that more than the territory of Louisiana in its territorial period from 1803, 1804, until it becomes a state in 1812. Other areas of the West, like Tennessee, like Kentucky, like Ohio, with a population moving in of white and black and establishing a territory and then a state. That was a process Americans would be familiar with. But what about a substantial thousands of French, Spanish, slaves, free people of color? How would that develop? And that uncertainty made life for Claiborne very challenging. So what we'll talk about next time in the next lecture, open up this idea that the West is an area of intrigue. And two of the events that take place I'm going to talk about in detail, the Burr Conspiracy and the West Florida Rebellion, all are tied directly to this new acquisition of land with Louisiana. Would the Americans in the West be loyal to their government back in Washington? If the settlement wasn't happening quickly enough for settlers in the West, would they cast their lot towards Spain? If we had purchased Louisiana from France, can we expand even beyond that? So even with this new land, people were saying continue to move west across the Sabine River into what's now Texas and Mexico. Take more of that land. That's where Burr is involved. And the unknown borders of the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson and Madison, his Secretary of State, may argue that the Louisiana Purchase included the Floridas. By that we mean areas of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and the panhandle of Florida. But Spain was not ready to surrender that land. And so for several years, the U.S. tried to work to expand what they thought was rightfully theirs by purchase. But of course, Spain was not willing to just surrender or turn over that land without any kind of resistance. And those will be some of the things we talk about next time.